Good evening and welcome to another edition of The World Today. I'm going to be talking about immigrants, immigration, asylum seekers, the causes of these, the history of these, and then seeing how the politicians of the Western world in particular, though they are not alone in this regard, deal with the issues and why it's become such a serious question today in North American and European politics. But first, a word about immigration. This is as old as history itself. It is impossible to understand our world, the world which we live in today, without understanding that the movements of people has played a huge part in its formation, in the birth of nationalities, identities, etc. In the old days, of course, 200, 300 years ago, they never called it immigration. They called it settlements, settlers. This was a code word for the Western powers, imperialist powers, who went and occupied any part of the world that they wanted. And the people that they took from Europe and subsequently from America were, of course, white settlers of one sort or the other, who took large tracts of land without asking permission of anyone who lived there. The pretense was that nobody lived there. This was, of course, never the case, neither in the United States or what became the United States, where you had small but significant Native American populations dotting the entire country, or in South America, conquered by the Spaniards from the 16th century onwards, where they found many, many more native South Americans than there were in North America. These were then either wiped out, died from diseases brought from Europe which had been unknown in these countries. So with this history, it is especially shocking that all these immigrant societies, some which sent migrants abroad because they could not stay, I mean, Ireland had a huge famine. Conditions in Italy, especially southern Italy, but not only southern Italy, were completely appalling economically. That is why people jumped on ships and went just to earn some money. And of course, in the middle of the 19th century, a large-scale migration from Scandinavia and Germany, again, to the United States of America. So with this history, what has happened to make immigration such a surprise? I think the answer to this lies in two things: race, class, and the economic crisis which besets the West. All the migrants who went from Europe to other parts of the world were white, and they established a hierarchy of color in the countries in which they settled. Most of the migrants who came to Europe at the beginning of the 20th century and in great numbers after the Second World War came from the former colonies of the European empires. Huge Algerian and Moroccan and Maghrebian settlements in France. They were welcomed earlier on because there was a shortage of labor as a result of the Second World War. In Britain, most of the early immigrants came from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or from the Caribbean islands, all of which had been British colonies. And of course, one has only to add the forced migration known as slavery, which was the capture and buying of slaves in Africa and taking them to the Caribbean and taking them to North America to work in plantations for the imperial powers, not to mention taking them to Brazil, occupied by the Portuguese who needed more labor. So these big slave-owning countries had a plan of forced migration, taking people against their will, buying human beings in markets, treating them as commodities. It's important to understand this when we're discussing the question of migration today, because the reasons for the migrations and asylum seeking of today are no different from what they were hundreds of years ago. Take economic migrants. Having wrecked the global economy, the IMF and the World Bank insisted on further cutbacks in social expenditure, helped to destroy the already small and weak social infrastructures in Africa, and then were surprised when African migrants began to move north. Why? The only reason that this attracted a great deal of attention was the color of the skin of the migrants who are now coming. The United States in particular is a country peopled by migrants. The native populations were virtually wiped out. Very small pockets still exist. It's a state and a country that is a state created by immigrants. So when people from Central America and Southern America move northwards, why the hysteria? Why the attacks on them? Not just by Trump, to whom I'll come in a minute, but presidents before him. Obama, who deported more so-called illegal immigrants than any other president before him. Nixon had a few racist words to say about Latinos and blacks. Reagan was no better. Trump now does it openly. That is the big difference. And he does it blatantly, and he is not particularly scared of being described as a white supremacist. Trump doesn't care about that. He says it in public, as we see in this series of clips. Now, we could compile a whole program consisting of clips from Donald Trump, but you might need a day or two to recover from that. So we're showing a few limited clips. Recently, Trump read a poem in public which was written by a civil rights activist, Oscar Brown Jr., in 1963, when African Americans and their white allies were fighting to transform the United States itself. The poem created shock and horror because of what Trump said about it and how he interpreted it.
We are going to make potentially the Trojan horse look like something that's very unimportant by comparison. And we don't want to be the ones that in 200 years from now they're reading about allowing something else into our country with a different name than the Trojan horse, but had the same impact. So this is called the snake, and this has to do with people coming into our country, and I think you'll enjoy it. Let's see. And more important than enjoy, I think it'll make a point. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Oh, well," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you."
The border.
"Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the vicious snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a comforter of silk and laid him by her fireside with some honey and some milk. She hurried home from work that night, and soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. Now she clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, you might have died. She stroked his pretty skin, and then she kissed and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite.
I have saved you, cried the woman, and you've bitten me, heavens why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die. Oh, shut up, silly woman, said the reptile with a grin.
You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in. Does that make sense to anybody? Does that make any sense?
Oscar Brown's daughter told Trump in public to stop misusing the point, stating, and I quote, "The elephant in the room is that Trump is the living embodiment of the snake that my father wrote about in that song." So when Donald Trump began his attack on migrants, he began it with gusto, openly. This is our America, we will protect and save it. We will build a wall to prevent migration from Mexico. Disgusting, but the assault on Latinos and the shock horror which passed through the world when children were isolated. Lots of liberals had tears in their eyes, and rightly so. These were very moving images.
¿De dónde son ustedes? ¿Y tú?
Guatemala.
No llores.
But this had happened before. Children had been separated under Obama as well. So why the double standards? Why the hypocrisy? And the reason is simple, because when the President of the United States, the world's largest and only imperial power, held in awe by Europeans and in other parts of the world, starts saying things in public which should never be said before the citizens. Citizens are treated in this new world order as children. And the politicians of the extreme center, right or left, used to say or whisper in each other's ears words to the effect, okay, we'll settle this, we'll sort it out, not in front of the children, i.e. our own citizens.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places, we can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch.
When Donald Trump first announced the separation of children from their parents, deportations, there was the usual wave of reaction from European newspapers and European politicians, as if Trump was doing something that they had never even thought of. If we look at what's been happening in Europe, the situation is no better. Take Italy, where two parties were elected to office. One of these, the Lega, a semi-fascist organization, was elected on the basis of denouncing foreigners and saying that if they came to power, they would stop all asylum seekers and migrants from coming to Italy. This poses a huge problem for the European Union since Italy is the first port of call. It's extremely convenient for the northern countries of the European Union to make sure that the refugees are unloaded in Italy or Spain, and then they try and negotiate with the governments, pay them off, see how much money they can give them, to either send them to Turkey, where they've given billions to the Turkish President Erdogan's government to stop Syrian refugees from leaving Turkey, and try and solve the matter in piecemeal fashion. In June this year, Italian Interior Minister Salvini announced a census of Roma live on Italian TV, and that those Roma found to have Italian nationality would, quotes, unfortunately, be allowed to stay, while the others would be deported en masse in large numbers.
Sto facendo preparare al Ministero degli Interni un dossier sulla situazione Rom in Italia, perché dopo l'intervento di Maroni, che ormai però risale a 5, 6, 7 anni fa, nessuno ha fatto più nulla. E quindi siamo tornati, temo, esattamente al caos. Oggi sul quotidiano Il Tempo di Roma ci sono 13 associazioni di quartiere che mi chiamano e mi dicono vieni perché c'è il disastro. Quindi mi sto facendo fare una ricognizione della situazione Rom in giro per l'Italia per vedere chi, come, quanti.
Eccolo.
E poi i Rom italiani, purtroppo te li devi tenere in Italia perché non li puoi espellere.
Sulla stazione centrale, Ministro?
Well, this created some tension with his partners of the Five Star movement in coalition with Salvini, who disagreed with this, said it was against the Italian constitution, etc. Opinion polls, however, showed a huge majority for Salvini. And if this majority exists for expelling the Roma, many of whom have lived in Europe for thousands of years, one can only imagine what the opinion polls would be for expelling Arabs, especially those with a dark complexion, but not just them, immigrants in general. After Salvini's calls for a Rome census, a video emerged from February 2017 in which Salvini said, quote, "We need a mass cleansing of migrants street by street, quarter by quarter."
C'è bisogno di una pulizia di massa anche in Italia, via per via, quartiere per quartiere, piazza per piazza, con le maniere forti se serve, perché sono interi pezzi di città, interi pezzi d'Italia che sono fuori controllo.
This is the revenge of Italian history, as if fascism had never existed. Salvini then tweeted to call for a census and tighter controls of the public money spent on the Roma. If the left proposes it, it's fine. If I propose it, it's racism. I get right to it and I don't quit. Italians and their security first. Another leader of the extreme right to level this claim was Marine Le Pen, who said that if she had used the same language about immigrants as French President Emmanuel Macron, she would have been called a racist and a bigot. Increasingly, as the politicians of the extreme center, in order to make sure that their vote banks don't drain away too quickly, use racist and anti-immigrant rhetoric, the parties of the right will grow stronger. In November last year, Macron was criticized for urging a Moroccan woman to go back to her country because France could, quote, not welcome all the misery of the world.
On ne peut pas accueillir tous les gens qui viennent sur des visas ou de commerce ou d'étudiants et qui restent après. Donc après, il faut retourner dans son pays, je vous le dis franchement. Après, on aide les gens quand ils sont malades. Je ne peux pas donner des papiers à tous les gens qui n'en ont pas. Sinon, comment je fais après avec les gens qui sont déjà là et qui n'arrivent pas à avoir un travail? Si vous n'êtes pas en danger, etc., il faut retourner dans votre pays. On prend notre part, mais on ne peut pas prendre toute la misère du monde, comme disait Michel Rocard.
Of course, Italy's new government doesn't only target the Roma. Recently, they prevented the Aquarius, a migrant rescue boat coming from Libya, from docking in Italian ports. Macron criticized Matteo Salvini, Italy's interior minister, for being cynical and irresponsible, but France herself declined to offer the ship, which was operated by a French charity, an alternative harbor in France. Salvini suggested the French leader should prove his generosity by opening up French ports and stopping turning away men, women, and children in Ventimiglia, the Italian town near the French border where migrants arriving from Libya often end up. Why are these Libyan refugees arriving in growing numbers? Didn't NATO promise the Libyans freedom? 6 months of war waged by NATO with the eager support of France, Italy, and Britain. There's something wrong with a system which creates the conditions for people to flee and then refuses them freedom. Meanwhile, many critics have noted that France failed to meet its 2015 target of taking 30,000 refugees from Italy and Greece as part of a 2-year EU mandatory relocation scheme. Emmanuel Macron's domestic agenda conflicts with the desire of EU leadership. This was the view of Bruno Cotres, a political analyst at Sciences Po, and he said it's a contradiction to look tough on border security and immigration to please an increasingly anti-immigrant population, while also calling for more EU integration and solidarity in dealing with refugees. It looks as if France, once again, is lecturing the others but not applying the rules for itself. Most recently, in Germany, a country where Angela Merkel, on impulse, without consulting all her cabinet colleagues, allowed 1 million Syrian refugees to come into the country, is now facing a backlash. Her partners in Bavaria, the CSU, threatened to bring her down by splitting from her government. And the reason was simple. They were fearful that new right-wing parties, well to the right of the CSU and the CDU, were gaining ground and that concessions had to be made. It is from cuts like this, small cuts like this, that gangrene spreads. And the German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, in order to celebrate his triumph and his 69th birthday, Seehofer decided to deport 69 asylum seekers from Afghanistan who were in transit camps. They were put on a plane and sent back. One of these asylum seekers, in his 20s, was dead when they arrived in Afghanistan. This is a situation which, of course, doesn't merely exist in the Western European powers who set up and created the European Union, but in the new entrants from the East. If you look, for instance, at what has been going on in a country like Hungary, there's been open war against letting in asylum seekers. Border police have been given instructions to treat them extremely severely. The situation against migrants in Poland under the current right-wing government is the same. And even in the Czech Republic, 2 supposedly center-left politicians, currently president and prime minister, former members of the Czech Communist Party, denounced by the current Czech Communist Party, it has to be said, are on the same anti-immigrant track. And this is a self-defeating process, because if the Poles and the Hungarians and the Romanians and the Czechs say that they are hostile to migrants, they put their own citizens who are working virtually all over Western Europe at risk. So it's a mess. And there is no immediate solution to the mess. The only solution is a complete reversal of economic and foreign policy by the European Union countries, which they have absolutely no intention whatsoever of putting into place, with the exception so far of Corbyn and the British Labour Party. But the notion somehow that the European Union is a beacon of progress on these questions is bizarre. It's Fortress Europe, that's what they call themselves, and the Fortress Europe means you keep migrants out. Of course, the Mediterranean, as we know, has become a graveyard for many, many asylum seekers and refugees trying to escape from war. But to conclude this episode, we're going to repeat a clip from a film we showed on our program Rear Window on this show in 2015, which turned out to be extremely prescient. Nikolaj Bendik Skiem Larsen, the Danish artist, made a powerful series of artworks called Ode to the Perished and End of Dreams, which act as a reminder and memorial to the suffering of the many thousands that have died crossing the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, hoping for a new life in Europe. The sad fact, of course, is that unless a new life is created for the European citizens who have been suffering under neoliberalism continuously in austerity measures since 2008, this will remain a worthy but a pipe dream.
A couple of years ago, I was invited to do a residency with an Italian arts organization called Quartz. Last summer and the summer before, you heard about all these migrants that come from Libya and Tunisia to Italy, Lampedusa especially, and also Sicily and the southern coast of Calabria. I saw this press photo of numerous bodies lined up on a floor in a big space, of dead bodies in body bags, made very, very similar to how I made my body bags out of concrete canvas. So I thought it would be interesting to make a new series of these body bag sculptures. Like I did in Greece, I wanted to put them in water for a while to develop this surface of marine organisms. And we constructed a big raft that was anchored to the ground of the sea. And underneath the raft, all these sculptures were hung to develop the surface. And that was all well and good, and they would hang there for some months, and then they would be taken up and prepared for to be exhibited. And then about a month into this process, this crazy storm, these gale force winds and crazy current in the sea just happened one night. The raft got completely destroyed, and the sculptures disappeared. And I lost everything. And there were bits of the raft that was anchored to the seabed that was still floating around, and there were a couple of sculptures attached to the raft still. And that was about it. And then I started thinking maybe there's something poetic and interesting and in the fact that the same forces of nature that puts migrants in peril and too often kills them in the sea, in the Mediterranean, completely smashed my artwork about this very topic.